Hey everyone, welcome to HR Tech Talks. I am Ben Eubanks, your host. I'm really glad to have you here in the conversation. While we're getting cranked up, getting started, before I bring the guest on, go ahead and chime in the comments. Let us know where you're listening in from, where you're connecting from. Just love seeing where everybody is, and we always have a great, diverse selection of people from around the world, honestly, not just here in the States, which is a lot of fun for me. So today's conversation, I'm really, really excited about, looking forward to it for a few weeks, because we're going to talk about pay equity, which is a big conversation. If your company hasn't talked about it yet, they're probably going to, and maybe you can bring that conversation up today. And in the conversation, we'll be talking with an expert in the space. She has a lot of background in compensation and now works with Curo, who's a compensation technology provider that specializes in pay equity analysis. And we'll hear more from Ruth on that in just a little bit. I'm really excited to bring her on. As we're going through the conversation, if you've got a question about pay equity, about compensation, about how to be more fair and transparent, any of those kinds of things, please feel free to chime in, drop that in the comments, and we'll do our best to make sure that's woven into the discussion so she can address that. Because again, she knows her stuff, she's sharp, and I learn something from her every time we have a discussion. So without further ado, I'm going to bring Ruth to the conversation. Welcome, Ruth.
Hi, Ben. Hi.
Glad to have you. So before we dive into all the fun, nerdy stuff on comp and pay equity and everything else, take a second and let everybody know who you are and what you do.
Okay, so I'm Ruth Thomas. I'm based in the UK. I'm based in London, actually, in the UK. I'm co-founder at Curo Compensation. I'm also the principal consultant here. And Curo, for those of you who don't know what we do, we're obviously an HR tech company, but we focus on compensation products and compensation solutions. And our aim really through our product portfolio is to make sure that our clients can optimize their compensation spend, make sure the right decisions are made about pay, and most importantly, make sure that those are fair decisions. So we have a number of products. We have our compensation management product, which is a typical pay review tool. And then we have a gender pay gap product for companies in the UK, and also a global pay equity solution, which is our kind of newest solution. So really the last few years been focusing on solutions to support pay equity.
Excellent. So I know one of the conversations I've been having more with employers in the last year is, hey, we're trying to get better on this DEI kind of thing, right? We want to get better at that, but we're not sure how to start or where to begin. And one of the places they can begin trying to make some headway and trying to make some improvements is around this pay equity piece, right? So talk about why that's become a bigger focus, because Curo started in the comp space specifically, but you've gone really deep in pay equity in the last few years.
Yes, I mean, we've been around for 10 years, and actually the whole concept of pay fairness was there at the beginning of our journey, because we know that when it comes to engaging employees around the whole topic of compensation, pay fairness is probably one of the critical principles that you need to think about. And there's a whole load of research out there that shows that, you know, when you look at why employees leave organizations for reasons relating to pay, it's often more to do with how they perceive they've been paid or how they think they're paid relative to their peers or to the market, rather than over an absolute value. So, you know, that whole concept of pay fairness has really been an underlying principle for us throughout our whole journey. And then, you know, as you said, it's become really a hot topic. You know, there's been a number of key inflection points in the last few years that really turned up the dial on the whole, you know, topic of pay equity, which has really become very much a, you know, societal issue, an economic issue, and a political issue.
Yeah, so talk about some of those kinds of things, because I know that, again, we saw some conversations here in the last year, like, okay, racial equity, for example, let's bring that together. But there's also, for as long as I've been in HR, as you said, right, there have been reports on the gender pay gap and how those things are woven in. And so talk about some of those kinds of things that you're seeing, because you don't just look at, right, a lot of our audience is US based, but they also are listening in from around the world. And one of the things that I appreciate about Curo's perspective and your perspective, Ruth, is that you're not just limited to one little segment. You have customers that are global. You get to see things. You mentioned some of the UK legislation on pay equity, for example. So talk about some of those things that you're seeing maybe around the world or here, it doesn't matter, that are kind of leading into that, because I think there's a lot of fuel for that fire.
Well, we've seen, you know, legislation. I mean, when it came to addressing pay equity, I think the main reason people that have done something on this would have done so due to the fear of litigation risk. And in the last few years, we've seen, a whole swathe of pay equity legislation emerging. So if you look back to 2017 in the UK, we had the gender pay gap legislation come in, which was we were the first country to mandate public reporting of the gender pay gap. So all companies over 250 employees have to submit their data to the UK government, and that's published on a website where you can go and compare yourself to, all your competitors and companies that you consider your peers. And that really, the start of a lot of legislation that has emerged. We've seen a huge amount in the US with salary history bans in over 30 states now. More recently this year, you've had the California Senate Bill 973, and then even more recently, great to see on Equal Pay Day, the Illinois Senate Bill, 1480, I think it was. So that, this growing body of legislation that is forcing employers to look at the whole issue of pay gaps and pay equity. But we've also seen social movements. Now, you mentioned, obviously, the Black Lives Matter protest last year and the protests against systemic racism that went global. It started in the US and then went global, and a huge response from the corporate world in terms of them speaking out against racism and committing to actions for that. But you can also look back again to 2017. We had the Me Too, #MeToo social movement as well in the back end of that year, which highlighted not just issues of systemic sexual harassment in the workplace, but broader issues impacting women, including pay equity. So it's been this combination of social movement and legislation that have really driven the awareness around pay equity. And then, of course, I can't not talk about the pandemic and what we've all been going through and are still going through, depending on where you're attending this talk from. And unfortunately, what the pandemic has done is really only further shone a light on inequity that already existed. And we look at the groups that have been most impacted through the pandemic, and that tends to be low income employees, women who've taken on greater responsibilities with childcare, and many have opted to reduce their hours or take themselves out of the workforce. And looking at racial and ethnic minorities who have been impacted more from a health perspective, but also due to their prevalence in the sectors that have been most impacted from an economic perspective. So really so much going on that is really driving this focus on pay equity.
Absolutely. Well, we actually just gathered the new data points in a recruiting study, which seems outside that bubble, but 7 out of 10 companies we talked to said we're planning on doing more hiring outside of our local area. And for some of those, it's the conversation is, oh, great, we get access to new talent. But then at some point, they're going to realize, wait a minute, they might expect to get paid something different than what we can pay them here. And so they're going to have to open their eyes a little bit on what those other sorts of pay scales look like and everything else. So there's lots of different things, just the fluid nature of work and the world being more global overall. Those are all probably pressure points too, helping to encourage this and to drive this. So talk about, there's lots of things pushing this. This wave is coming. So talk about the tools that Curo is building to try to tackle some of these issues, try to solve these problems, try to help employers get their arms around it, because it's, any one of those things you mentioned could be enough to create some angst and stress, but all of them put together makes you feel like it's a little bit overwhelming.
Well, we're really proud to be part of this new emerging D&I tech market, really. And, we're really focusing on analytics to be deployed across the pay decision process. But if you look at how technology can really address D&I challenges, what it can do is help to create consistent practices across the employee life cycle. And we know already, that HR tech analytics can help to simplify complex decisions and track outcomes more effectively. So it's about, deploying consistency and deploying greater insight and tracking, outcomes on a more effective basis. When you think about pay decisions, I don't know how often you've been involved in pay decisions, but there are many data points that are involved when it comes to making the right pay decision. And that's why, pre-technology, I was a reward practitioner for many years. I'm used to working with spreadsheets that were, 300 columns long that we used to give to managers to help them support decisions. Well, the good news is we now have technology that can do that and make the whole experience much more engaging and much more insightful. And that's really where, we find being able to process those multiple data points and present that data in a meaningful way to make the right decisions is really proving to be effective.
So in terms of my background, I usually like lead off with that early on, so you know what that connection is. I have been on a compensation review board with our leadership team in the past when I worked in HR and had to be. I built the spreadsheets that said, okay, we're going to sort this data by the women in our workforce, or the minorities in our workforce, or the people over 40 in our workforce, right? Trying to sort it every possible way to account for every potential way that someone could potentially hit that discrimination button and find out if were doing the right thing, whether intentionally or inadvertently. Either one doesn't matter. The result is still the same. And so we were working to make sure. So I've been in the midst of that. The spreadsheet comment brought me back a little bit, but I've been there.
A mild panic at that point, yes.
Oh, goodness gracious. I'm like, thank goodness. So when you wake up and you had that dream that you forgot that last test in college, and you're like, oh no, I forgot. I was going to ask you though, because that relates to the question I was going to kind of throw back in your direction, is that the tools are valuable. The tools can bring insights. The tools can bring the data together. But talk a little bit about the kind of the cultural or the leadership aspects of approaching pay equity as a conversation, right? Leaders have a lot of different choices they can say as a priority for the organization. What would you encourage them? If someone said, why should we focus on this? Or what's the priority here? What would you encourage them with?
Well, I think initially, as I said earlier, it was a focus on mitigating litigation risk, and that was really the angle that most people came at this with. And actually, ironically, that involved in a lot of people not wanting to do pay equity analysis because of the whole issue of disclosure. So if you have an equal pay claim and you have done analysis, it could be used against you in a potential case with an employee. And so, we have seen previously, I know I was guilty of it myself. We would do pay equity analysis and then shred it, because we didn't want anyone to know it existed. And I think that is changing. I think there's now an appreciation that not doing it doesn't mitigate risk. Actually, your risk is only going to get bigger because the unfortunate truth is that most organizations have legacy pay equity issues. Unless they're a brand new startup, most companies are going to have some form of pay equity issues going on. And unless you start to address that risk is just going to sit there, and it will compound, unfortunately, year on year, because each time a merit review goes by and someone's paid unequally, that will just be reinforced in subsequent pay rounds. So really, now I think there is much more of a feeling that we need to get on this and we need to start doing pay equity analysis. And then I think the other real driver here for leadership is it's become very much a reputational issue. And we've seen that in the response, the corporate world's response to the protests last summer. And it's really about, proving to your multiple stakeholders, so not only your employees, but also your customers, your suppliers, your investors, and the communities within, where you sit, that you are committed to fair pay. And that is really becoming very important from all aspects.
Excellent. I'm glad you talked about that. And one of the visual I just got when you said that about the compounding risk piece. We think about compound interest as this thing that builds over time and it builds on itself. And the compound risk of not doing this, I've never mentioned it that way, but I might have to borrow that one, because that's a really powerful visual to say the more you avoid this, it doesn't just sit there. It gets worse and it gets worse and it gets worse. And we're missing this chance to really dive into that. We actually just had a question pop in here. I'm going to bring up on screen for you because I think it's really relevant to the discussion. I'd love to hear from you. I don't know how much of it's going to block. It's a long question, so let's bring it up here. There we go. Okay. So, recent study by work labs, women feel like they're being forced to compromise despite low pay and overqualifications. Only 44% of working moms surveyed said they're being paid what they're worth. How do we change that status quo? Or how do we move the needle on that one? It's a big problem.
Well, obviously, pay equity analysis is only one part of the story. And, one of the outcomes from your pay equity analysis should be looking at the whole topic of pay equality. And, I think personally, pay equality is as important as pay equity. And for me, the definition of pay equality is where all employees have the opportunity to earn the same. And so to get to that point, you really need to look across your talent life cycle and look at the various barriers that there may be to entry into the workforce or progression within the workforce. And, to the questioner's line of inquiry there is really, when we look at women in the workforce, there are many blockers around their caring responsibilities, and that is something that needs to be addressed as a proactive part of your DE&I and B strategy, looking at how you can support the ability for women to be able to balance both caring responsibilities and participating in the workforce.
Excellent. Thank you
It's
for the
interesting.
question, by the way, and thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's interesting. A couple of our clients that we're working with on pay equity analysis are actually starting to track primary care status as one of their data points, and we're using that in pay equity analysis. So it will highlight, basically if you're the primary carer or not the primary carer, and they're going to look at the impact of that on data analysis. So I find that a really interesting and innovative thought process in terms of processing pay equity data.
Absolutely. I'm as a researcher, I'm always looking for those things that are either a direct or an inferential sort of line that will help me to understand another piece of data or understand how this applies, or to look at it in a new kind of way. I think that's a great example of that. I spent some time last year talking with some organizations that were doing some interesting and innovative things on the child care front, because they said we don't want to lose access to this portion of our population that's working for us. It brings great ideas. They have all these insights and everything else, and if we just let it go and let the natural course of things take effect, then they're going to have to, someone's going to get pinched in that.
Yeah.
And so they were looking for ways to support that in a way to support equity in the organization and equality in the organization. But you would have said, oh, they're doing a child care kind of initiative. Okay. It wasn't a benefits thing. It was an equity thing. And I think that's a great way of looking at that as well. Awesome. So one of the, let's see, trying to go back to, there's one thing you said a little bit ago, so I'm going to come back to and talk through. So you talked about why companies have struggled with this, right? There's some hesitancy around committing to that. And we found that actually we did a study on the compensation market a few years ago. And when people were open about, here's what's working, here's what's not working, here's where we tried something and fell down. But other than one company, everyone I asked about pay equity, they said, oh, well, legal handles that. Or we can't really talk about what we're doing there. We're not sure what's going on in that space. And I feel like now we're doing some more interviews now, and I think it's going to become a bigger part of companies saying, we don't know how we're going to solve this, but we at least are going to try to shine a spotlight on it so we can identify how much the issue is there and to what degree the issue is there, so we can decide what to do next. Would you encourage companies to start doing that kind of thing, even if they don't know how they're going to solve it ultimately, to start taking steps around that and being more transparent?
Yeah, and that's really what we're trying to do with the technology. And the typical approach to doing a piece of pay equity analysis was to outsource it to legal, and that tended to be a point in time piece of analysis that came back to you and you were presented with the results. But in today's agile world, that just doesn't cut it anymore, because there are so many employee related transactions that happen once that analysis has been done that allow potential pay inequity to creep back in. So every time you hire someone, every time you promote someone, all those types of activities, pay is changing, and we've got that opportunity for inequity to creep back in. And I think that's really, a lot of the people that we talked to when we were designing the global pay equity product, that was the challenge that they were facing. They wanted to do more frequent pay equity analysis, and they wanted to have greater ownership of it. And so our aim was to bring to market self-service technology that allowed companies to do pay equity analysis. And there was a more cerebral desire that I had, I guess, which was to democratize the process. I didn't want any company to be able to say they couldn't afford to do pay equity analysis because they happened to pay, a huge consultant's bill. So, I didn't want any company to be able to say that. What we've actually seen really in the market practice is most companies are in their infancy stage in terms of pay equity analysis. I think there was a World at Work and Korn Ferry. We worked with Korn Ferry survey done at the end of 2019 that said 60% of companies were aiming, to tackle pay equity. And we are definitely seeing, an uptick in the number of companies wanting to proactively take this analysis on themselves.
I'm not surprised to hear that numbers going up. Again, we talked about all the triggers earlier,
Mm.
and those are continuing to kind of come in on a regular basis. One of the things that I'd love for you to touch on, because sometimes the pay equity conversation is just well, the female pay gap is X, and they're ignoring a lot of other factors there. Will you talk about intersectionality for a minute and how that might come out in terms of pay differences among someone's employees? Because they might, if they're only looking through one lens, they're going to miss some of those other kinds of things that might kind of creep up and bite them on the backside if they're not prepared for that.
Yeah, well, I mean, without doubt, pay equity analysis can be quite complex, and if you're going to build statistical models, particularly including the right factors in that is a challenge, particularly for someone who's not done any pay equity analysis before. So I mean, that's where we'll help support clients, and other consultants will help support clients. From the intersectionality perspective, we have kind of built in analysis within our product that allows you to load as many different protected categories as you wish, and then you can layer those over each other. So when you're running statistical models or when you're looking at outcomes, you can see the outcomes from both a gender and a race and ethnicity perspective, for example. But it is important to look at it from all angles. And I mean, we've done probably a whole load of assignments over the last 12 months, and I can say for sure that every one we do, there is a really interesting outcome that you just didn't expect happen. And that's because there's been some factor that, is explaining pay variance that we weren't quite explaining, understanding how that did and what an impact it had. So, it is very much a learning experience as you go through analysing your own data, because it will be very different from each company.
So you're saying that there's not an easy path there. Maybe there's not a one size fits all approach. Probably. That's kind of leads into one of the questions I'm going to ask you. I see stories in the news occasionally, right? Citigroup is doing great things trying to get women into leadership, and part of that is to balance the pay scales, right? Salesforce is in the news because they're trying to make a pay equity adjustment. How transparent should employers be as they're working through this with their own workforce or with other leaders in the business as they're trying to figure out how to go about this? Because there are companies that take transparency to some radical extreme. There are others that don't share anything. And I would imagine the right answer is somewhere in between those two extremes. I'd love to hear from you because you've seen in so many companies and their different cultures and how they approach this. What are your thoughts on how open they should be about this?
Well, some of those companies that you've mentioned, and a lot of the larger companies that we've seen that have publicly shared their data, have been pressurized to do so by activist investors. So, that's I mean, we often get that, question asked of us, how do we communicate this, and do we communicate publicly? I think a lot of people will look at their results, and those that tend to have a very small issue will think, oh yeah, we're brave enough to go public with this. Others who may have, issues that they need to resolve are not ready to go public with that. I think you should always share it with your employee base, but you have to be careful about how you phrase that and how you share that information with them. But we provide lots of tips to our clients around the best ways to do that.
Excellent. Again, that was what I was expecting to hear, I think, but I wanted to make sure and let everyone hear it from you, because you've seen probably some of these kind of decisions where someone handles that. They might go have the best intentions of how to solve this problem, and then handle the communication piece of it poorly. And communication and how you share that, and what you share and whom you share it, that's just as important, if not more important, as doing some of these other pieces of work there. Because ultimately, no company is going to do this analysis with the intent, like, how can we be the worst we can be at this? We have hopes that we can, hopefully, we're doing a good job, or we can solve for this problem. And if you make the misstep there on that piece of it and how you share it out, it could hamper your efforts to actually solve that, kind of like you were alluding to there a little bit ago.
Yeah, and I think, we always encourage transparency, because it is a bit like holding a mirror up. And if you're honest about the fact that you have a journey to go on, and you have issues that you need to resolve, and you have issues that you're going to work on, your employees are going to value that authenticity more than them feeling that there are things that are wrong culturally in the organization, them feeling that they're paid unequally and not really knowing what's going on, the whole aspect of comp secrecy. So, you asked about pay transparency and where is the right place to be. It is really important. And I think as an employer, and if you're talking to your C-suite about this, it's being authentic, that word I just used, around if you say you value your employees or your employees are your greatest asset, then prove it and pay them fairly, and understand if you're paying them fairly. So I think there's a lot of work that we need to do around aligning what we say and how we are treating our people to how we actually are treating our people.
I'm going to ask you one more question along this line, because I want to make sure we're plumbing the depths of this. I don't want the people listening to this that are in HR and comp or in talent feeling like all this is on your shoulders. You've already said earlier that your leadership should be on board with this. Talk about the role of managers in this, because oftentimes they're the ones making recommendations for compensation. We did with an analysis a year or two ago, and we found when companies are getting rid of performance reviews, for example, the most common way they're making a comp decision after that is they ask the manager, how much did this person earn, without having some sort of rating attached to it anymore.
Yep.
And so talk about the manager's role in this. Partly, I won't give you any more seeds for that one. Just talk about that piece of it, because I think that's a critical part.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's important in pay equity. It's important in general, when we're working with organizations on the compensation review product. And it's always surprises me the number of organizations that say, well, yeah, we don't trust managers to make pay decisions. It's like, well, why don't you trust them, or are you giving them the information to, the right information in order to make appropriate pay decisions? If these managers are able to make, business decisions and decisions about, capital expenditure, then surely they can make the right decisions about pay. And I know there's always the people element there, the subjectivity element related to people, but it really does come down to being training managers and being transparent with everybody in the organization about how pay is determined and how pay progresses in the organization. They always say there's 3 things employees want to know about their pay. It's, how their pay was set, how they compare in terms of to their peers, and how they can progress their pay. And I think if you're a manager and you can set your managers up to be able to communicate those 3 points, then you're in a good position.
All right, I want to make sure I got those 3 again, because that was great. How their pay is set, how they compare, and what was the third one?
How they can progress their pay.
How they can progress, how they can move up. Okay, excellent. I think that's a really great kind of framework for managers. If your managers can't answer those questions for their people right now, if you're hearing this and you're thinking, I don't know, if Mary or Sue or Joe or whoever else, I don't know if they can answer those questions, it's time to pull them in. It's time to spend a little time educating them so they can answer those questions, because employees want to know. And if the managers aren't sure, they're going to skirt the issue or avoid it, or they'll say, go talk to HR, go talk to comp. And that's missing a chance to really connect with that person and to give them some instruction that's going to lead to them being more engaged, more connected to their work, more excited about what they're doing if they feel there's a path ahead. We just finished a study today, and resoundingly, employees said, we want to feel like there's some sort of path ahead of us. If we don't feel like it, we're going to leave. We're going to disengage. We're going to disconnect. So this has been tremendous, Ruth. If someone wants to know more about Curo and the work that the organization's doing, what's the best way to connect?
Well, you can get in touch with us on our website at curocomp.com. And I don't know if you're sharing my LinkedIn details as well as part of this event. But yeah, please get in touch with us, and happy to continue the conversation.
Okay. If you are on LinkedIn watching this, then Ruth's LinkedIn account, her LinkedIn account is right there on the description for this episode. Just click on over there. If you're on YouTube, you'll have to jump over to LinkedIn or catch the show notes on the website after we post the archive. So either way, make sure you follow her, connect with her. The stuff she's talked about today, she talks about on a regular basis. She's incredibly sharp. And again, now you know why I said at the outset, I learn something every time I sit down with her, because she knows her stuff. In addition, Curo is doing great work in the space, not just to solve comp problems, which are a very real thing. That's a real problem. They need to be solved. But they're really leading this charge on pay equity, and I appreciate what they're doing there and continue to do there with the team. So, Ruth, I appreciate you for hanging out with me today, for spending some time sharing your knowledge freely with the audience. Thank you so much for being willing.
Thanks for having me. It's been great to have another conversation, Ben. Always love it. So,
yes, ma'am. Absolutely. You have a good rest of your day. All right. Goodness, that was so fun. And if you couldn't tell, Ruth is actually over across the pond. So hello to the audience over there in the UK and Europe. She's representing you today and represented you very well. Thank you to everybody for hanging out with us today. I hope you got some great insights out of that framework for how to help leaders talk to their people about compensation, different pieces that tie into this discussion around pay equity. There's so many things there, so much. It's easy to feel, again, overwhelmed, I said earlier, but she laid out some really great steps, some ideas. And if you're looking for tools to help, give Curo a call, and they'll be happy to walk you through what you need. So thank you for joining me on HR Tech Talks today. I appreciate you for hanging out with me, and I'll see you again next week when I talk to another HR technology company that's serving people well, is doing innovative work in our space, and is doing some fun stuff. So I appreciate you. Have a good one.